What if the legacy that made him unforgettable was also the one that left America holding its breath in stunned silence? Johnny Depp, the rebel who turned Hollywood upside down, the wanderer who carried storms behind his eyes, the man whose every character felt like a secret whispered in the dark. For decades, he built an empire shaped from imagination and defiance. Blockbuster fortunes, iconic roles that rewrote pop culture, and a net worth that once soared above the dreams of any outsider who dared to step into this industry. Yet the brilliance came with a price. The mansions, the islands, the staggering collections he guarded like memories. They were not just signs of success, but echoes of a life lived at the edge of firelight. Through the applause, he stood like the last outlaw of modern cinema, a figure both adored and misunderstood, carrying a fortune that made headlines but hid wounds no one could see. And behind that dazzling empire lies a cost America never expected, a story woven not only from wealth and fame, but from a silence that still lingers when his name is spoken. He didn't come from the marble gates of privilege, nor from the golden avenues of destiny. Johnny Depp was born in Owensboro, Kentucky, into a life where silence settled on the walls like dust, and childhood felt more like survival than innocence. His family moved from state to state, drifting through small towns and narrow hallways where arguments echoed and dreams struggled to breathe. He grew up watching instability carve lines into the faces he loved, learning early that nothing, not comfort, not home, not peace, was ever guaranteed. Hunger wasn't always about food. Sometimes it was the hunger to be seen, to escape, to become someone time couldn't break. Music was the first door he opened. A cheap guitar, worn at the edges, became the only place where the noise inside him turned into something that made sense. He played until his fingers burned, until the world around him blurred into rhythm. And in that fragile rhythm, he found his first glimpse of freedom, a promise whispered to himself in the dark that he would outrun the chaos life handed him, that he would never again be powerless. And from that unresolved childhood, from dust, cold nights, and unspoken prayers, a fire quietly formed. The fire that would one day build an empire the world could not ignore. His rise didn't begin with a spotlight. It began with closed doors, cheap motels, and nights when music barely paid for gas. Johnny Depp arrived in Los Angeles with nothing more than a guitar, a restless heart, and a defiant belief that art, any form of it, could save him. Acting wasn't the dream, it was an accident born from survival. But the moment he stepped in front of a camera, something shifted. There was a flicker in his eyes, a quiet tension, a storm no one could name. Casting directors saw what he never saw in himself, a rare ability to turn pain into presence. A Nightmare on Elm Street cracked the door open. 21 Jump Street blew it off its hinges. Overnight, the kid who once slept in borrowed rooms became the face every magazine chased. But he didn't want stardom, he wanted transformation. Roles that let him disappear and rebuild himself from fragments of imagination. Then came the revolution. Edward Scissorhands, Captain Jack Sparrow, Donnie Brasco, Raoul Duke. Each character carved deeper into Hollywood's bloodstream. Each performance forging a myth around the man who refused to follow any rule but his own. And with fame came an empire, multi-million-dollar salaries, back-end deals that turned films into fortunes, properties scattered across continents. He owned a private island in the Bahamas where the ocean swallowed all noise, a French village he restored stone by stone, penthouses in Los Angeles that glowed like stacked jewels above the night. His art funded these havens, and his solitude filled them. But his wealth wasn't just property. It was the tangible evidence of a boy who once promised himself he'd never be helpless again. He collected rare guitars as if retrieving pieces of his past, filled rooms with paintings and artifacts, created a world where imagination didn't just live, it ruled. Every choice he made seemed to echo the same truth. He wasn't building luxury, he was building safety, walls strong enough to hold the storms he carried. Yet with each ascent, the air grew thinner. The applause grew louder, but the silence waiting at the end of every night grew heavier. Fame crowned him, fortune surrounded him, and the world watched as he turned his own life into a monument of triumph. But when triumph grows too tall, its shadow grows just as long, and in that shadow something fragile began to tremble. He had everything, yet lost what mattered most. Amid the mansions, the islands, the shimmering fortune that Hollywood celebrated, Johnny Depp was fighting storms that no red carpet could conceal. The world saw success, but behind the locked doors of his quiet nights, he carried a lifetime of fractures that fame only deepened. Relationships slipped through his fingers like sand. Love arrived like a bright flame and left as ashes scattered across years of misunderstanding and regret. The boy who once wandered through unstable homes grew into a man who built many, yet still couldn't find a room where peace stayed long enough to breathe. As the years passed, legal battles, personal wars, and relentless scrutiny dimmed the fire behind his eyes. The cameras that once crowned him now followed him like shadows, capturing not the art he created, but the wounds he tried to hide. Silence became familiar. Loneliness crept in, even when he stood in front of thousands. Inside the echo of applause, he felt the unmistakable chill of being utterly alone. There were nights when the weight of fame pressed so heavily that even his vast empire couldn't lift it. The penthouses, the carved wood in his French village, the turquoise waves around his private island, none of it could drown out the storm within. He faced the unraveling of trust, friendships fading under the strain of public judgment, and the realization that the world he built to protect himself had slowly become a labyrinth he could no longer navigate. His body bore the cost too. Exhaustion carved lines into his face, and his voice carried the heaviness of someone who had weathered too many winters of the soul. The man who once transformed pain into art now found pain invading every corner of his life, uninvited and unrelenting. And yet amid the noise, what hurt most was not the accusations, the headlines, or the losses. It was the quiet moments, sitting alone in rooms filled with memories, knowing that the empire he created could not shield him from the emptiness that lived in the spaces between laughter and truth. All the homes he built, all the treasures he gathered, could not shelter him from the storms within. And in that silence, he faced the one truth that fortune could never rewrite. Even legends can break. When the storms finally quieted, what remained was not the noise of scandal or the weight of public judgment, but the undeniable truth of what Johnny Depp had given the world. His legacy was carved not only in numbers, the millions earned, the properties scattered across continents, the collections that told the story of a man who built his own sanctuary, but in the unforgettable characters that reshaped American cinema. Captain Jack Sparrow became more than a role. He became a cultural monument, a symbol of freedom and rebellion that entire generations grew up with. Edward Scissorhands turned gentleness into power. Donnie Brasco revealed the quiet bravery of a man living between two worlds. His films continue to echo across theaters, classrooms, childhoods. A catalog of stories that made people feel seen, understood, and less alone. Beyond the screen, his generosity often lived in silence. He visited hospitals without cameras, supporting children who clung to hope the way he once clung to music. He helped fund artistic projects, lifted young musicians, and offered guidance to actors searching for direction. For a man who battled his own darkness, he somehow found ways to bring light to others. And that light, soft but persistent, is part of the legacy he leaves behind. His fortune, though immense, is not what America remembers first. What endures is the imprint of a man who dared to live according to his own rhythm, who turned pain into art, and who taught millions that imagination can be a form of survival. What he left behind wasn't just wealth, it was a map of endurance, resilience, and the truth that even the most complicated lives can shape beauty that lasts far beyond the person who created it. And for those who felt something in his work, who saw themselves reflected in his strange and brilliant worlds, his legacy is not gone. It is carried quietly, forever, in memory. In the end, his story folds back into the same quiet that shaped him. From a childhood of drifting walls to an adulthood spent building worlds on screen, Johnny Depp's life formed a circle, rising from silence, returning to silence, but leaving brilliance in its wake. The empire he created, the characters that became part of America's cultural heartbeat, and the memories he scattered across decades now stand like lanterns along a long, winding road. They glow softly, even as time moves forward. What remains is not the noise of the battles he fought, but the echoes of the worlds he imagined. Places where misfits found courage, where brokenness became beauty, where the strange became sacred. In those creations, he left pieces of himself for anyone willing to look deeper. And as they continue to live on, so does he, in a way that defies endings. Because legacies like his do not fade. They settle quietly into the places where stories are kept alive. From silence, he rose. And in silence, he left behind a legacy that the world will carry gently for as long as it remembers him.